Hello and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who calls the dark, calls the black, brings it forth, and calls it back.
Tim Longo. Yeah, was that a line from the end there?
That's famous last words. Yes, of the Trickster.
Yeah, man. His all the dialogue there is pretty interesting. They did a good job with that. It's very
really. It feels old world, old god. It's eerie.
Mm-hmm.
We are, of course, talking about Thief, the Dark Project, the 1998 title from Looking Glass Studios. Fantastic to revisit this, although the lows seemed lower from a modern lens, as sometimes happens. But some of the highs are still pretty great because there's not as much like this, right? There's not a lot of games like this, so it's there never have been really, but it seems like there's always one or two a year maybe of this sort of game if you're lucky. So
yeah.
We had a few kind of mixed bag of topics to pull out. One of them I think we should start with because it's kind of the lowest level thing, and then we'll move to some of the other stuff. But is the equipment types, and I think from that we'll talk about shifting your approach to enemies because I think that probably means using different tools. Maybe not, but we'll see. But yeah, there's a variety of gadgetry, and I think we both played it pretty straight up stealthy and mostly using maybe the water arrows and occasional bonk on the head. Would you say that's how you played?
Yeah, I think for the most part, I guess largest percentage, that's how I played because I felt like it was the path of least resistance based on how the game was tuned. When when the level started getting a little long on the tooth though for me, and whether I got stuck on something and forgot how to do something or just was just progressing too slowly and frustrated, I would start speeding up and then I would start experimenting more. So that's why I want to talk about this a little bit because I did start using flashbangs and fooling around with those. I basically started using everything. I ended up really liking the mines specifically, which, because you obviously can kind of lay traps for people and take use the perception system against them, right? Of course.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was
basically kind of kite them into a location.
Yeah. And so, and one being with the gas mine being quieter than the regular, shrapnel mine or whatever it was. So you could still draw more attention, but it was kind of interesting to use those. And both of them basically were one-hit kills. And so, and occasionally you could even do if you could really make it happen, you could basically kite a bunch of them and bunch them up, because they basically will, once you, which I did a lot, once you poke the hornet's nest, and basically they start basically training through everybody, and they pick each other up as they're running, and then they all end up running about the same speed and clump up together. You can get a mine that hits multiple at once, which is pretty gratifying. It's just pretty obviously cumbersome to set that up,
right?
But it is possible.
on the stream we were talking about because I streamed a lot of this, maybe all of this game, but we were talking about how in EverQuest you could kite. Yeah. You were a bard, I guess, and there was that wonderful blog about a fellow who stayed below the PvP level limit, but maxed out his training skill, or whatever it was called, to drag the monsters around, and would just have them chase after him and wreck players who were higher level, and they'd all be super frustrated. I have to track that down because that is some funny stuff.
Yeah, it's classic. Yeah, I mean, kiting trains of enemies, that's all. Those are MMO lexicon that I believe started with EverQuest. I played a lot of EverQuest back in the day. And so, yeah, that was, and bards were, notorious for that. I hadn't read that article though, or heard about that particular guy, but
Oh, it's
that's
hilarious.
pretty
Yeah,
clever.
I'll track it down. I can't remember the name. It would be easy to find if I could remember the name, but I'll see if I can find a
Yeah,
link
that's funny.
and shoot it your way. Yeah, I am. I mean, I didn't. The only time I used a flashbang, I accidentally threw it. Like it when I switched to the method of having your inventory pop up when you pick something up, I would often accidentally use the item right away. So I threw a flashbang or flash bomb or whatever immediately upon picking it up and got a little dazed.
Blinded yourself. Yeah,
it wasn't great. It was amusing, but it wasn't great. I think that was on the opera level, and I don't think I ever used the mine at all, or the gas arrows. I really didn't use a lot of the tools.
Oh yeah, and the gas arrows are another example of something that I grew to love and actually used in the last couple levels when I had them because they're so effective and quiet as well. Because for most things I've found, it was one hit and they're down. I definitely started using fire arrows more too, just for kind of the fun of it, and those were generally effective. There were some enemies that seemed to be immune to fire or something, so like the mantis people. And then and the flashbangs actually, which I think is a level we'll probably talk about shortly. In Escape, I actually used them. I used all of them that I had because I was just running the whole time. Yeah. And that was a really good way to clump them up, throw a flashbang, and then keep running. You basically, it's just basically stunning them, right? So, so it gave you enough of a head start. But yeah, what a frustrating level.
Yeah, that was my Edge of Tomorrow level. I was just constantly trying, like, I'll try this, and it was so rapid fire. The stream's probably still up on Twitch.
Yeah,
you can just watch me like die 80 times. It's absurd. Yeah, so we will definitely talk about
like a
that.
Platformer run, like
exactly
or something.
Right, exactly like that. Exactly right. It definitely felt that way. And there was a point at which I'm like, this is absurd. I'm never going to leave this level. This is where I lived it. But we'll get to that in a moment. I mean, you mentioned some of the new enemy types. They sort of shift here at the end of the game once you get the eye, I guess, basically, because then Constantine takes your eye and the eye and is going to use it. And after, so it's, but even before that, you have more undead because there's different types of undead people in the cathedral as well. There's a pretty drastic shift in the makeup of the enemies at this point in the game. Almost a complete disconnect, really.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of, to be honest, I was dreading the end because I remember this shift being so abrupt, and I felt like the peppering that they did earlier in the game was sort of like felt about right for palette cleansing and pacing changes and such, and some mechanical changes, but because they lean into it and commit to it so heavily toward these last four levels, it's really felt unfair to me because they're building up this fantasy in a pretty specific way for most of the game, and we've talked about it in another series as well, for especially in this era where and it happens with most games, to be honest, where there's always this sense from the developers that we feel like we need to shift things up on the player because we feel like, oh, they've been doing this sort of same kind of thing for a long time. They're of course going to want to be thrown for a loop, and really have to adapt. Right. And sometimes that works out, but I feel like a lot of times it doesn't, especially on a game like this, where I feel like they were so successful with the Thief fantasy and everything else around it, and then when you combine that with enemies that kind of really contradict that in some ways, not in every way. You definitely, some of the rules still applied to the Skull Knights or whatever they're called, but some didn't, and so it's kind of, for me, it ended up always being frustrating, and it changes the tone of the game. It changes, and I think it actually makes the game weaker for it, in my opinion, too, because of that. But yeah, I mean, how did you feel about that?
I mean, I think it's a case. I actually don't think it's let's shift this thing up on the player so much as we have a story that wants to go in a particular direction, and they're trying to support the story. I think is kind of the underlying thing here is like, oh, we're going to have. I mean, they're definitely into their lore, right? They love the fact that they've got the Hammerites and the Keepers and the old god whatever, the Trickster, but I mean just kind of like something older, something prior to the sort of established order, and they really love the tension between those things, and unfortunately when they then lean into the I mean, I think it would have been actually a lot more interesting to lean into like, what if the Keepers were now the bad thing, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're like a better human enemy, right? They can do a lot of the things you can do, and stuff like that. I mean, it would have to be a different story. Obviously, the Keepers would have to be a different sort of organization. But having a sort of organization like that is like the Thieves Guild, basically, might have been kind of more interesting from that way, and leaned into the existing gameplay. Mm-hmm. But those things get developed often in parallel, and you sort of see where they didn't know when they're writing the story that the Thief fantasy was going to turn out as well as it did, right? And so there maybe they were a little story forward, and kind of were pursuing that, and that was kind of the interests, for maybe the people at the top. It's hard to know. But yeah, I mean, I agree that you get to the end here and you have these, the monkey men who are a little easy, can see you a little bit easier, I think. And then the, crawfish / mantis / whatever they are, things that are a lot harder to kill. And then things like the exploding frogs were just a super annoyance more than anything else, because you often couldn't see them when you were trying to sneak. And by the time you realized they were there, they were on top of you. And, especially in Escape, you had so very little health, that it was very frustrating. So yeah, I mean, I agree. I also feel like the last level kind of does the right thing in making it fairly easy. So that you're, and that's something we'll talk about, I think, when we get there, but that you've learned enough about these things that you know what you can do with them. So yeah, I agree with you in principle that it's maybe not the right way to lean.
Well, it's a good point about their motivation, which I hadn't thought of it from that perspective. But if it is story forward and that's kind of the motivation for some of why they're shifting the enemies up, then I guess my analysis would more lean toward, okay, if you're going to do that, make sure you reassess the mechanics that are working so far with the human enemies, and try to come up with enough crossover rules that it doesn't frustrate the player that, they've changed up so much. An example being, whether true or not, I had the same perception that the monkey enemies did have, they were more easily to see you. And so, but that's a trial and error revelation, right? You don't you can't. They don't have systems in place to really tell you definitively, so you're kind of guessing at it. The only saving grace I had there, which I discovered through my chaos play, was that they're weaker. They seem to be weaker to the sword, so I actually could take them down pretty easily. But then again, that's a good example of, okay, you make them weaker. However, that means you're going to be encouraged to use your sword, which the game is not good at. You know what I mean? Right, so it's like, well, okay, sure, that mixes it up some, but you're encouraging them to use the thing that is not part of really the fantasy, and is actually, I think, the weaker part of the game, even though I did eventually get fairly good at it. It's just
probably a lot better than me, because I hardly use the sword, and I didn't find them any easier. Although that was especially the case in Escape, where I was at such low health that it was basically a one-hit kill for them. So yeah, it became a real issue. The thing that I ended up doing a lot of, and the game leans into this, is on that I guess next to last level, where you're rescuing the high priest of the Hammerites. I was there were a ton of arrows, and I was using those to hit them in the head
from behind.
From behind, right?
Yeah.
And that's a one-shot kill,
Yeah.
and that
was
leaned in
consistent.
pretty well.
Yeah.
So that felt a little bit better. But I mean, there's nothing to do with the insectoid creatures. There's really
gas.
Oh well,
yeah.
Okay, gas worked well. Yeah.
That was the only. That was the only thing I discovered. I agree, because they're the ones that were, I don't know, seemed to be immune to fire or something. I couldn't tell, but I would shoot 3 fire arrows at one and it wouldn't go down, and fire arrows with everybody else was one-shot kill. So yeah,
and those things are rare, and you don't want to waste a bunch of them, right?
No,
I mean, that's
exactly.
Interesting. Interesting choice.
The example that we already talked about, which I think is a good example, we talked about last episode, I think, which is a good example of mixing it up. But staying within the rule set is the the fire elementals, or whatever those balls are, with water arrows, right? Because that's something that is inherently obvious and you can feel clever for doing, and it doesn't change your expectation in an unfair way. You know what I mean? And I feel like that's a good, like, small example of the thing to tease out of, like, the right way to do it versus some of these other examples, which,
that's a good point. I mean, there's definitely a sense when you realize that you can do that, you feel really clever, and that makes you feel more like a thief, right? I mean, the thing is with these other creatures, you don't like. There was nothing that I could think of that made sense for why anything would be more effective against the. Yeah, I mean, they're basically the chitinous armor of an insect. I just was like, fire was the only thing that really made any sense to me, and that I also discovered that didn't work. I didn't even think to try the gas, because it just wasn't something I ever reached for in the toolkit, and there's no way to connect gas to those things. And there's no clues really even earlier, because when you're in the Lost City, there's those posters of those things. And I almost wish that they had used that opportunity to, like, hint at you that gas would knock them out or something like that, that you'd have that opportunity to pick that up and pick up on a clue. But those posters were really just a picture of their heads or whatever. I mean, they were very simple.
Or they had so many. We didn't talk too much about it, but one of the things I have always liked about this game is are the pickups, the text pickups, right? The whether it's a scroll or a book, and books. It helps fill out the world and the lore, and kind of like get you kind of in the mood of the game, because of the writing is quite good and on point. But then they also often use it for clues and things, and they could have done a whole, well, in fact, I think the later games and Dishonored and stuff do exactly this. They kind of thread in some of the sort of weaknesses of certain enemies via this system. And I think a lot of games ended up kind of going in that direction in a good way. And so, they wouldn't have known at this time. But. Yeah,
that's a good point. They use it often for, like, we've hidden, the special treasure in, such and such room that's hidden, in the library or whatever. They do that sort of thing, but they don't do a lot of using those in a way to sort of give you useful information for play, other than achieving those specific objectives of finding, somebody's special safe or what have you. So yeah, that's a good point. That is kind of a missed opportunity there, to have. That would have been perfect for the Lost City to have. Because those people apparently knew about those insectoid creatures, right? So they had pictures of them everywhere. It would be the perfect opportunity. Or maybe that's their city. Maybe that's why they don't have the information. But I don't know. There could have been a place to put that in.
Mm-hmm.
So let's. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I was going to move on to one of the other levels we haven't talked about, but where were you going to go?
I was going to say, let's talk about the overall story arc and then hit the particulars of the levels.
Okay, yeah, let's hit that.
Because we definitely shift into really the third act here. Really, this whole section is basically the third act, I'd say.
Yeah.
And it begins basically when you realize you've brought back the Trickster god, or maybe are bringing back the Trickster god, at least aiding him at the end of the haunted cathedral. And like I said earlier, I do, generally speaking, I really like that conflict, the conflict between this mechanical age, and the Hammerites, and how rigid they are, and how I love the books in their temple or whatever, where it's explaining how what's a tower but a tree that doesn't die and fall over and die, right? What's
Yeah.
and they sort of make these analogies between, well, we can make a better thing, right? And when we're living in an age of disruptive innovation, I think the Hammerites were the original disruptive innovators. They're going to throw out all the old stuff and just build something new and not think about the way things used to work. And they kind of make a whole religion out of it, which I would also argue the technical innovators of our society tend to, which is a whole separate issue. But it feels kind of prescient, engaging with that story now, and when we're living in a time when nature is fighting back or simply reacting in very, very strong ways to the decisions we've made with our technology. It feels very close to home at the moment.
You're finding some good deep connections. That's nice.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in Maryland, and we just had tons of rain this hurricane season. We didn't get hit by a hurricane, but a lot of them spent time, passing through the state, and you knew how bad they were because of how much rain they were still dumping, 5 days into their trip.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, and they kind of that feel and perspective on technology and combining it with religion. The Hammerites have always reminded me a bit of the Brotherhood of Steel. You know what I mean? Where there's sort of like that kind of interesting combination of two things that don't always, obviously go together. I guess it's an interesting, combo there. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, we tend to think in our own reality of, the church being particularly strong prior to the Renaissance, right? And the Enlightenment kind of changing that equation, and that's of course when technology actually starts to rise, of course, and they've done something different here, where they've basically linked, certain ways of thinking about technology to this sort of central religion and kind of structured religion. And yeah, that's a good call out to the original Fallout, to notice that that's kind of similar. Yeah, interesting.
The other, with the story overall, the one thing that I probably just didn't spend the sort of mind energy on really analyzing each of the cinematics, but all of the text and prose that is flying through over the screen there, as each one, they basically usually they either start or end with some sort of text from some book that you don't know where it's come from, and you don't get to read the whole book, so you just get these passages. It's biblical and feels very biblical in that way, or classical. And it's like there was a point, especially because we played the game much more quickly than I had in the past, right? In a given month, and when I'm going through these so quickly, I'm not really digesting them, and they kind of just started washing over me after a while, and I feel like I'm bummed about that, because I feel like it probably, it adds a lot more if you're really trying to analyze what it's saying. But on the other hand, I'm also kind of wondering, and I wanted to ask you about it, I'm also kind of wondering if really any of them make that much sense or difference to the of what's going on. You know what I mean? Because
I think they're hugely flavorful more than anything else. I think they give you. I think they're really just, here's this faction, and this is its kind of tone, and the Trickster faction, such as it is you get the reflection of the Trickster. There's goofy language. Often I remember one late in the game where the letter Y was basically added to a number of words that normally aren't.
Very Gollum.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a lot of people were a lot of people in the stream were calling the monkey men golems as well.
Totally.
And then with the Hammerites, you definitely get that same sense of the sort of rigidity, but also the sort of I don't want to say religious ecstasy, but it's kind of in that direction of how important this stuff is to him. And then the keeper stuff is all very watchful. Obviously, they're very just let's wait and see. There was a prophecy. We'll see if it comes to pass, right? And there's just kind of the we'll wait and see, and we don't get to we don't interact too directly with all this stuff because it's playing with fire or what have you.
Yeah,
and so I think you get that sense. And I actually on the stream would do these in kind of sort of high pitched funny voices or something like that to undercut the gravity of the situation.
Oh, you were reading them?
I was reading them as the text was coming across.
Oh my God.
But I would read him like the guy in
Monty Python,
Princess Bride, the Princess Bride, where it's like marriage,
Yeah.
And so or a high voice or whatever. But I didn't do like one per faction, so there's more work than I was prepared to put in. That
would have been a tour de force if you had. That's impressive.
I'm not making enough money at this to spend. But yeah, it's that's really all I get from that, because then you get Garrett after that, sort of telling you what's going on. So I think it's really just to keep in the player's mind that there is this conflict between these.
Yeah, it definitely accomplishes that goal, and if I just put it in the sort of character of faction or tone of faction or tone of the game, it definitely helps, I think. And I'm really overthinking this one, but I feel like whenever you commit that much to text on screen and it's not even narrated, I guess for me mentally, and this is just probably a personal thing, I'm going to assume that it's important to understand what it's saying. Do you know what I mean? That there's some hidden meanings in there, or that especially because there's so many collectibles that are text based and kind of story based. So, but that's just me. I think I've just gotten used to really caring about that stuff. But at some point, as you're going through them, you're kind of like, okay, yeah, these don't really mean anything. They have no purpose there's no, I guess maybe it's my OCD / completionism gene coming through where I'm looking for clues. I'm looking for some sort of like answer to something, because overall the macro story pretty simple, right? And pretty streamlined, and maybe at times I wanted there to be more depth, but I think it's not the kind of game that really could accomplish that anyway. So at the end of the day, it's probably better that it wasn't there. But I was forward to
you have to
wherever
keep in mind it's another 15 years before you get something like Gone Home, right? Where you're in the first person. I mean, and that's not even the first, but easily a decade before you're using first person tools to do much deeper. Dear Esther too, but that's kind of, even that's not really about the first person interaction for that stuff. Gone Home really, I guess, kind of sets that apart. So
no, but it's just interesting. Every time I play this game, I forget, how deep they did go in the lore direction in a cool way. And I don't think I ever finished 2, to be honest. So I can't even speak to my memory of sort of how the lore continues, if it continues being successful, or if they keep consistent, or what have you. And as I always say after we finish a series, I should go back and play that the next 2, and maybe we'll get a little bit of tidbits from some guests if we get them on about that. But it's an interesting world. It's a cool, different, not your traditional D&D kind of Tolkien-esque kind of situation, in a good way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, to tie that back to the enemy types, because they're trying to do something different, they have less ability to rely on archetypes that you might have had from D&D. So
that's a good point.
maybe, I mean, I'm not going to say excuses any mistakes, but it's more understandable that, well, they didn't have a model that they were trying to work from, and that's more effort. I mean, you did make the point, like, well, maybe they should have reconsidered in light of what was working in their game, right? And it's absolutely no argument. Maybe they should have, but that is more work, right? That is more taking
and
that time, and
yeah.
Today we would totally do that, I think, because we'd know that we'd be in real trouble if we didn't. But games get developed over more time these days as well, so you have that time to realize, oh, this is actually really working. We should lean into this and do less of this other thing. And
it's also hindsight.
Made in a couple of years. Oh yeah, and totally
hindsight for us, right? We have the benefit of analyzing
20
this
years.
game 20 years later, and we've talked about this topic a few times over the course of the podcast. But in the era that a lot of these games were being made, the sort of usability and testing process was not what we have today, and so the sort of scrutiny on some of those things sometimes this isn't even caught, and not even thought about until after it comes out, and then it's obviously too late. And maybe
and by the time they're maybe making these later levels, the team's already really good at the game, and something like escape is not difficult for them. Which is a real issue with game development. Certainly when we started, is that you have no idea whether your game is too hard or not by the end. I mean, I'm thinking about it. We're playing on the easiest level of difficulty.
Oh, that's good. That's true.
It's still quite hard. And I'm on record years ago of saying, look, your lowest level of difficulty should be push button win game. It should be really easy. If you want to reach those players. Maybe you don't want to reach those players, and that's also a reasonable choice. But you have to know you're doing that. And I do think that this easy level isn't easy enough. So
yeah. Well, and I mean, some clues about whether they identified this, they weren't able to maybe react in time for the launch of the original, but some clues that that they were at least identifying some of their success cases is both in, I'm sure it would be interesting to see where they end up going with 2 and 3, right? Largely made by a lot of the same people, to see what they emphasize. And I believe, from my memory of what little I played of 2, and then kind of looking over some of the stuff in 3, I also played 3 but didn't finish it. But you can see them going in directions that we're talking about, because they seem to have kind of caught their strengths and leaned into them. The other clue, I think, is that the fact that we played Gold, and in Gold, which was essentially almost like a kind of a DLC sort of situation in the re-release. I'm looking at the list here: Thieves Guild, the Mage Towers, and Songs of the Cavern were the 3 new gold levels, and those largely all focused on human enemies.
Right.
And so they kind of, and they were very much like best of, and so you could see that probably they kind of did know what they had at that point.
No, that's a good point. And of course, as they're doing that, they're gearing up for the Metal Age, for Thief 2, and probably are sort of doing this whole searching of like, well, okay, where did this really succeed? Probably also reading reviews, and making those determinations. So yeah, for sure. Let's turn to go over the levels that we played. And then we'll, I guess, switch gears to takeaways. The first one, I guess, is returning to the cathedral, which I really like the little loop there of, oh, I was here, but I couldn't get in, so then I had to go and do this other stuff and come back. I always love that in games of this time. It's a little less common today just because there are so many more open world games, and of course you're going to go back to places all the time, right? The change in sort of design has made this less of a thing, where you sort of have this narrative loop of, oh, I go do these other specific challenges and I come back to this one place, where I've been before, and it's all been building up to this or whatever. It's not entirely gone, but I just feel like you see less of it as a result of being less level based, more continuously loaded spaces. So I like that about it. I like the I like the chapel part of it. I felt, oh, this is pretty cool. I'm climbing. I'm making my way up. I'm finding my way basically through the puzzle of how to get to the place where I can get to the eye. And then we have the part that you weren't crazy about, and I want you to take me through that, because I had less difficulty with it just because of how I played, which was totally luck, and it just kind of happened randomly. You had some issues.
Yeah, because of my befuddled play style sometimes, where I was just sort of like stumbling through and kind of running past things and such. And in some cases, some of the enemies, especially like the zombies, of course, is the best example of this. You can very easily, run past or really kind of outsmart and not even worry about stealthing through things. So there's not, and to some degree, some of the other enemies in here. So I started the level basically doing a lot of that, right? Just kind of outsmarting them and to be honest, like exploiting and cheesing it a little bit. And I was just kind of like I've said in the beginning, I'm just fooling around with the boundaries of the playstyle that I was used to a little bit to see what would happen. But what ended up happening is when I get out of the chapel and I'm in that back area where there's those other buildings and the cemetery and all that stuff, because I had consistently just been, playing in that way, I was skipping a lot of stuff and passing a lot of stuff. I was just kind of trying to get there and get to, the gate, or what I thought was the gate, right? And so what ended up happening is I missed a lot of the sub-objectives. And then when I found the ghost and he's sort of talking to me about all this stuff, I'm like, wait a second, you want me to go back and get into all the places I've been and try to figure out, find the needle in a haystack in some cases where the clues that he gave you were not perfect. And so, at that point, everyone was kind of looking for me.
Right.
And so I was like, well, I kind of got to go back into the
I kicked the hornet's nest, and now there's hornets everywhere, and I got to run back into the hornets.
I got to go back in through, and and so it ended up being this very weird way to play, where I'm kind of trying to just cheese my way to each of the items, and then the added extra frustration for me. And of course, I'm fully admitting that this is not the ideal way to play this level. But I'm just sharing it for the sake of the podcast. But then the other thing is every time you get back to him, he has another thing, so
right.
I've talked about it before. The moving the goalpost challenge, right, is tricky. And basically they move the goalpost in this level like 5 or 6 times. It feels like you get back too much. Okay, now go and do this. Now go and do this. And I'm like, really?
Yeah.
And so it just kind of went on and on in a frustrating way. And it just ended up being the way that I ended up playing it. And then the last one, you got to go back into the chapel to get the ball. Yes. And I'm like, oh no, don't make me go back into the chapel. Oh no. And
same. That part of it was a little trickier. Although I guess I hadn't stirred them up quite as badly, and I kind of walked in there and I could just kind of wait, and a few undead would, some ghosts and some zombies would shift by, and I could go straight up the stairs, and it wasn't horrible. But I totally get what you're saying. When I played it, I actually encountered 2 of the objects that Brother Marus or Marus or Marud or whatever his name is wants. I had 2 of them already, and I just need to get 2 others. And I get the clues might have been a little. I forgot that it was kind of. He would say, "Oh, I remember. I would, be being at my desk and be able to look over the garden or whatever." Yeah, that's.
That
one's obvious, maybe more than
others. A little
others,
bit better, yeah. But I mean, also like, because of the way I was playing, running through things, I was sort of like, wait, where's the garden? So I kind of had to even go back and backtrack. And then the other one, that's what
the map's for. The garden's clearly labeled.
Yeah, but then again, I'm like, well, I don't need the map. It's like I'm being dumb. But then one of them, he says like near the well. And I don't think the well is on the map because I did look for that. And I'm like, I never saw a well. And then it turns out the well is pretty well hidden. Kind of in a corner through well the back hidden. Of the, I meant that.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's, it's a bit of a weird complaint because of the way. I think if you played it more like you had, then it would have been fine. But, and then the other small thing that I do want to mention kind of on the positive what this level does force you to do is really come in close contact with those skeletal warriors. And the audio design on those guys are just really good. And
Yeah.
there are a couple of moments when I'm hiding in a dark corner and they're walking right towards me and stop right in front of me, and wait. And I'm waiting to make sure they turn around before I move, and just having that right there with that great audio, and knowing how powerful they are, just really great tense moments.
They basically have multiple voices kind of overlaid, right?
It's very interesting.
Right? Yeah. It's like they're a bundle of trapped souls or something like that. And
there's a lot of other audio like clanging, and of course their chainmail as they walk, and just very really well realized enemies, but also really rough.
Yeah.
Don't fight those guys with swords. That's my suggestion.
Yeah. I also ran into a bit of an issue at the end where I put the bomb down next to the door and I shot it with a fire arrow and the door didn't open.
Oh, what?
And I'm like, oh, well, I mean, obviously I had to reload at that point.
Yeah.
And I'm like, am I not in the right place? Like, what have I done? And it turns out you basically have to drop it like bumping up against that door, and maybe I hadn't quite put it close enough, but that's a little frustrating. That's the sort of thing we wouldn't do today, where you go what, if you're anywhere near this thing, it's going to open the door. Just so it's clear that but I ended up running around the level a whole bunch after that, being like, what am I missing? And then I went back and tried it again, and because I couldn't figure out what I was missing, and I just didn't put it in exactly the right spot, I guess. That was not a great moment, but I mean, I totally get it. At the time, issues like that, again, they knew what to do. It's a very difficult thing to test yourself as to if you're the level designer or even somebody on the team. It's difficult to do that wrong because you know what you're supposed to do. And that's like you often say, it's a really helpful thing to have outside testers come in and be able to tell you. But with a game like this, could they tell you? Like, there's a lot you have to know how to do to play this level. So it's tricky. This tricky thing. After this is my least favorite level in the game.
Mm-hmm.
I did not like Escape. I love the setup. I love that the Trickster imprisons you behind a bunch of wood, plucks out your eye. I even like that the monkey men later will then say, "Damn your eye." I think that's hilarious, as if they know exactly who you are and that the Trickster took your eye. I love the setup, and then the actual escaping is the level that's a total wall mission. That's totally a level that I think people would quit at, especially if they're playing. I don't know how I got through that on a high level of difficulty. I honestly have no idea. I don't remember it. I think I blocked it out. I mean, that's the only explanation I have.
Yeah, my vague memory is that it just took a long time. I think I was pretty methodical in the past, but I really didn't want to replay this level. So I used my previously mentioned tactics of just running, and cheesing my way through it a bit. And it kind of sounds like in pre-show you mentioned, we kind of did it in similar ways where you're just save scumming and, and kind of like doing these, trying to figure out the perfect run to get through it just unscathed, as much as you can. And the level is very confusing from a level design flow sense anyway. So even when you're running, it's frustrating because you can really just go to dead ends, or, there's a lot of dead ends, which is probably very intentional. The one minor thing that I did like about it is that the flow to get out has similarities to your flow when you came here the first time,
right?
And so it's kind of neat to kind of jump out the window that I jumped into when I first came to Constantine's, manor. So that was kind of cool. But other than that, it's just and then it's just chock full of enemies, So This is kind
and
of
far too many. I mean, it was for me. I mean, what I said in pre-show is it was my Edge of Tomorrow level where I'd run up to a place and die and be like, okay, well, I have to deal with something before I get to that place. Maybe I need to poke into a shadow here so I can wait 3 seconds and then run. And I just did that again and again and again. And I mean, I did it so many times. And then you finally get up to the actual house that you already kind of know the layout of. But you're only getting to a part of it. And now you can't, at that point, you're like, oh, maybe I can stealth around, except that there are these very small exploding frog things that are basically a one-hit kill for you at that point because you start with such low health. And you can't pick them out if they're not moving. They're very difficult to see in that environment. And so it was epic. I was in that level for a long time.
Yeah. Well, it's also, like we talked about, it's an example of sort of mixing it up on the player, but in a way that the game doesn't, support very well,
Yeah.
So anyway, the thing I liked about the next level, though, Strange Bedfellows, which you mentioned earlier, is just the returning to a space with a completely different context. It was kind of, having spent a lot of time in that level before when you're getting that one rune, and so my memory of it was still pretty fresh. And so walking into it and having that surprise of, talking about Strange Bedfellows, by the way, and then having that surprise of like, oh, the Hammerites aren't here. Oh my gosh, somebody broke in. Oh, Constantine's already been here, and the aftermath of it, and you're kind of walking around largely empty once you take out a couple enemies, and it's kind of cool. And then to kind of uncover that there's a ladder down the well or wherever that was, some hole, I forget what it was exactly. Oh no, it's underneath. It's in the chapel underneath the altar or whatever. And so that was just super cool, because you've been there before. And then having this whole other world revealed to you underneath. And then I just hit some frustration with again, we already talked about with the enemy types down there, largely. But other than that, it's kind of interesting switcheroo in this case.
Yeah, no, I didn't hate it. I found I was definitely had a hard time. I got a little turned around. There was a point at which you hear through a window the Hammerites talking, and then just like a scroll and a key maybe show up, and I didn't really follow that.
There's a guy talking to you, and he
I guess I think I had moved away because I thought I was hiding from them, right? Which didn't make any sense. But I'm so used to hiding from the people, and so I was further away from that, and I didn't hear it clearly. And then the stuff was there. I'm like, oh, I guess I'm meant to have this. So it's like, oh, this explains why I couldn't move forward. So that was a little frustrating. I also, when I ran up to where the raft was, I just pulled the switch, and there went the raft.
You don't have to use the raft, though.
Oh, can you just swim with them?
There's another path.
That's right. There's another doorway. I forgot. Yes, there's another doorway you can get down there. Yes. So they planned ahead for that. But in the moment, I was like, oh.
Yeah, that's very funny.
Have done that. Because I was like, well, I wonder what this does.
Most people probably pulled it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interactable. I should interact with it.
Yeah, you're trained to do that throughout the game. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's pretty funny. Yeah.
And we move on from there to the finale, which I'd say that both of us played sort of similarly from our pre-show chatter. I did it more sneakily than you did. I basically, no enemy noticed me the whole way down, even though I was moving pretty quickly. You took a different approach, I gather.
Yeah, I mean, I was running through a dungeon in EverQuest, basically. My good old days. And basically the which I think we talked about this in pre-show, so I don't remember if we've already covered it, but Brett mentioned, the structure of this level allows for a lot of one-way gates. So, I could train a lot of enemies and pull them and kite them through, and then once you kind of jump off of a ledge or go down a snowbank or whatever the heck that level's got in store for you. Most of the enemies that were chasing you just can't anymore. Right. So it was actually pretty easy to kind of do that, which is unfortunate, because unless you think, if you think to do that, it really not deflates, but it, like we talked about, it kind of changes the tone of the game quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I had gotten pretty good at sword fighting the monkey men too. So when I saw one of those by themselves, I pretty much just went head on, and it's easy enough to circle strafe them and stuff. By the end. And it's just, it's just I feel like we talked about this some, but it's this weird era of these, how do you end these games? And you have to go to an otherworldly place.
Yeah.
To like, have this palette cleansing change and kind of this crescendo. And, this for me at least, it didn't hold up as well as I think it probably did at the time.
I do like it definitely has a body of the many feel to it. I do like the that final challenge with him basically, and he's doing
totally. I'm talking about the rest of the level.
Yeah, the rest of the level. Yeah, you have that weird river that has gravity in all these different directions, and although that is a thing generally I like in video games when they do things that are unexpected like that. So there are bits of it that I kind of like for that. But there's some sort of platforming in it that's kind of weird and not really in keeping with the game. There are these devices that you take you up to different levels. There's too many spiders. And I did like that Garrett recognizes at different points how crazy what he's doing is. So that was also a strength for me. But I mean, it leads up to this great final moment where you do actually have to use your tools. In this case, a moss arrow, to quiet your approach to where the trickster is using the eye and your eye, and you have a fake eye that you're going to switch in that the Hammerites gave you. And that's great because then you just kind of sit back and watch him do his thing.
You get to listen.
You get to listen to him doing his poetry.
Listen to him. Yeah, it's a good. Despite the rest of the level, this little ending moment is just quite good and quite memorable. And like you said, it definitely brings to bear all of your tools, or many of your tools, right? And he's walking in a pattern that is sort of roughly seen on the floor, right? So you can kind of pace out where he's going to be and stuff. Even though this time I found a bit of a not a cheesy way, but I did kind of subvert some of it by doing it pretty quickly. But it's still, like you said, you get to kind of watch him do his thing, and you feel very thiefy, right? It's kind of a heist, Indiana Jones heist kind of thing, right? Because you're switching, you're switching the idol for the bag of sand, and then watching the fireworks, which is neat.
There was one other thing, is that I had someone comment in the stream that it seemed too easy for a final level. And I'm of the opinion that a final level like that should be easier than what came before. You want the player to coast and have the memory of triumph and not the memory of frustration. Is the way I like to think of it, is because if you have to do that thing, if you have to do that section with him, 20 or 30 times, or some other challenge 20 or 30 times, what you remember is, man, it took me forever to beat that thing, and not, I had this cool narrative arc come to an end in a pleasing way. And I think in this game, story is really important to them. And I think that because they ease up on the difficulty pedal a little bit, they allow you to have that story moment. So I think that's pretty great. So
yeah, I agree. It's kind of rare, to have that commit to commit to that. So it's kind of nice difference from a lot of things we played.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's take a quick break. Come back with our pillars and a new mini feature for the podcast, and also some feedback.
Exciting.
welcome back from the break. Because we're here at the end of a series, it's the time when we like to talk about our takeaways from a particular game. And I always let Tim go first because he always has more of them than I do.
Yeah, I mean, I think the takeaways for this, as I'm looking at the ones that I noted, we've really hit quite a bit already, more than most examples. But the first one I'll throw out there, which I'm sure we both have in some form, is the essentially their full commitment to the thief fantasy is how I wrote the note down. And as I think we talked about early in the first episode, probably, really just that was such a rarity and such a unique perspective on a fantasy-ish kind of game, and we talked a little bit about some of the legacy of, the history of this project and sort of how it started and how it migrated toward this. But in an era of power fantasy shooters, this was just a very unorthodox thing. And they, for the most part, with the exception of some of our criticisms, they really, went full on, and I just always loved that about the franchise. And I think that's why this game stood out, in a year, as we talked about, that was pretty darn challenging to stand out in.
Yeah.
So the thief fantasy and having the mechanics and systems and level design and story design and audio, everything, music, really all, unified around that vision. So I really appreciate that. So that was my first one.
For sure. Yeah. It's something, we touched on the fact that often in RPG, and particularly sort of 2D isometric or top-down games, the thief is, it does things mechanically, but often you don't feel like a thief. It's more like in Baldur's Gate, having some outlines appear of a thing that you can click on and have it not be a trap anymore. It doesn't feel like you're being a thief. It feels like I have this special vision mode. And this is really different in that way. All of his concerns and the way he moves and his equipment, everything is bent to this. I'd say my first one is technology can be a feature. And in this case, I particularly mean their audio technology, which is well above what other folks were doing at the time in terms of 3D positional audio and the attenuation and things like that we talked about a little bit, I think maybe in the first episode. All of those choices are not easy choices to make at the time. Technology is often the most expensive thing to develop for a project. PC audio hardware was good at this time, but still hadn't quite reached the point where 3D positional audio was an easy thing to do. So it wasn't a natural fit to do that, and to sort of pull that in to how they underlie the simulation and things like that, I think worked really well. They also wrote their own 3D engine as well to do this game. And I think that has, right, when you have to do things like dynamic lighting for some of their lights, not all of them, you end up with sort of similar wins from those bits of technology that they do use to differentiate their engine from others of the time, and that helps sell this experience. And without it, it would be a poorer game. It is the sort of thing that I occasionally notice when I play. I mean, I'm always paying attention to the technology, but I mean, sometimes I actually notice and say, oh, wow, this technology actually really stands out in support of the game that they're making, and not just any game. I think a lot of the engines that we see, especially the ones that are general purpose, tend to be, they do everything you want them to do. They're really good at lots of things, but they don't have individual technical features that really set them apart. And this one definitely does. So it's nice to have the opportunity to say that to as the programmer guy, to be able to say, yes, the programming on this game is particularly excellent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the lighting as well, pretty right. I mean, just the shadows being such a critical part of the gameplay, and having a lot of engines not dealing with shadows very well in this era. Having that be, because there's some nice rooms and some nice lighting composition where they really, not only just from a gameplay perspective, but they do things with the lighting that was ahead of its time.
Yep.
With that, yeah, and then also those shadows matter. So, and having a mechanic that actually really at least communicates to you what the shadows mean with the shadow gem, the light gem. Yeah.
Yep.
Which is a good segue to my second one, and probably just the two I'll talk about. I had a couple other small ones that they're just not too much to mention. But the summary, I guess, is sort of, I guess I'd say like the focus on simulation and systems in a first-person kind of game. We've talked a lot about this with Looking Glass and Ion Storm games, and a couple other series that we've done already. And so it's not really new to this company and these developers, because they already were thinking this way. But this is one of their earlier ones, obviously Ultima as well. And though it is largely a linear game and very much a first-person game in many ways, and there's plenty of scripting and pathing and stuff, but the perception system combining with the lighting system, combining with the damage models, with the ultimate example of this is the rope arrow and the surface treatment that they have with the levels, right? Where wood means something different and allows you to access and kind of bypass areas and be creative, and so it wasn't as elaborate as some of the stuff they do later, not as elaborate maybe as even Deus Ex or something, but you can see the foundation of the way that these developers thought. And when you look at the credits list of this particular game, it's pretty astounding.
Yeah, it's a who's who.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. I was looking at the credits again today, and it's just almost every one of the people that worked on this game and at the company at this time, went on to do similar and cool things in various places. So, but yeah, so sort of that legacy is definitely here and alive, and it was underneath the Thief, wrapped in the Thief fantasy, but still the tenets were still there.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely was thinking about the sort of immersive simulation stuff, but I knew you were going to talk about it. So my second one, I guess I only have two because that was definitely one of them. Is don't be afraid to do something other than the default for your sort of ancillary systems. We spent a lot of time talking about the map, a little bit of time talking about the lockpicking. But what I'm saying there is basically, you could have had a mini map that was embedded and you could see it. In fact, the Thief 2014 has the ability to just kind of look at the map on the screen. It is a little stylized, but it's still pretty much perfect information. Here, it's not perfect information. They're taking that moment to support the game, support the fantasy. They're doing that with the real time sort of lock picking instead of having a mini game, which again they do in Thief 2014, and it's pretty good actually. That's a strength of that game. I think this first approach of you have a couple different lock picks and you got to figure out which one, and you're really locked in on being close to the door, and people are going to see you if you're there too long. Supports that fantasy when another game might have just gone and put the game is paused mini game kind of there, like a BioShock did a few years later. And I love those choices. I love that they took the time to really break down at any point and say, well, it doesn't have to be this. It doesn't have to be that. They even make the starting equipment negotiable, which is something we talked about. That's pretty uncommon in first-person shooters of the day. It used to be you'd either pick up everything you needed in the level or you carried over whatever you had, period. And there was no, I'm going to make decisions with the loot that I've picked up to buy things that I want. And all of these are pretty minor things, really, in the grand scheme of things. They're not super hard to do. But taking the time to say, we're going to make even this sort of ancillary stuff that most people don't think about a big part of our game, I think is a great decision.
Yep. It's a good one. Yeah, those are my main ones. I had a small point about just their crazy story, and then generally kind of about the tone and mood of the game. But we talked a lot about it already, so
Yeah.
yeah, that's
Oh,
it for me.
all right, and that's it for us, I guess, on Thief. So yeah, fantastic game. I'm glad
Great
to have
game.
done it. I'm going to continue to stream the Thief 2014 game a little bit, probably this week. So for folks who are interested in what an actual continued in the lineage game looks like, you can come join me on my Twitch stream. That's Twitch TV / Brett Duville. I'll probably stream Thursday night because there's no World Series game that night. So
It was a good, also a good spooky game for Halloween.
yeah,
I
it
was,
had spookier moments than I remembered. I was
yeah,
like, well, the kind of tone is right, but definitely towards the end, especially, it gets really, really. And there's even some gore when he loses his eye. So it's got lots of horror beats in it. That's pretty good.
Yeah. One I didn't write down that I'm just thinking of right now when it comes to like final words on it. I think we hit this early on, but Garrett is just a memorable character. I don't, for me at least. I'm not sure why. He's obviously kind of a bit
Voice
of
acting goes a long way.
yeah. I think he's a bit of an archetype and trope kind of character, but I always liked him. And just his attitude, a little bit, especially at the end when he's talking, to the keepers and stuff. And he's the kind of character that you want to play more as and see where he goes with things. But it's just such a memorable game, and as far as stealth genres go, it really is one of the pillars of that genre.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It really is. And it's funny because, I'm working with somebody now who did a very different sort of stealth game in Mark of the Ninja, Nils Anderson.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a game that makes many, many different choices. Everything is a lot clearer in Mark of the Ninja, but it's a 2D sort of game as well. So it's a different viewpoint entirely. It's trying to make stealth, I think, a little more accessible that way. But I love both of those games, and they both, if I were to make a stealth shelf, they'd both be on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of games these days will incorporate stealth elements as sort of part of the feel of the game, or part of the character of the game, or part of the makeup of the main character of the game. But it isn't really kind of deep in the bones of the game, as it is here. Or as it is in Mark of the Ninja, for that matter. So it really is top notch. Head of class. It's first in its class as far as thief games go, stealth games go.
Yep. So you have a new segment you want to introduce, right?
I do. I was thinking, so folks may know if they followed me on Twitter while I was active on Twitter, I read a lot. I am on my 230th book this year right now, and it's October. With a real push, I could probably make it to be one book a day average, but it'd be a real push for the year. But I'm going to come close. I'll probably read 300 books this year. The most I've ever read in a given year since I was a kid, but that's still a lot. That's what I do with my spare time, especially with this injury I've had. I thought it'd be nice to take that and find a book pairing for people of things that I've read sort of fairly recently with the games that we've played. And I thought immediately of a couple that would go both with Tomb Raider, which we played last, and with Thief. So for Tomb Raider, I thought it'd be really cool for folks to check out something. It's set in a different time period, but it definitely captures the sense of Lara Croft, the English sort of wealthy adventurer. And that is Tony Cliff's Delilah Dirk series of graphic novels. It's a beautifully illustrated series. The main character is Delilah Dirk. It's set in the sort of Napoleonic era. There's a little bit of magic in it, but mostly it's adventuring and in sort of far-flung places like Turkey and southern Spain and this most recent one. They're kind of all over the place. And she's accompanied by her faithful lieutenant, Turkish lieutenant, Salim, I believe his name is. It's a fantastic series. It's got great sort of humor, a lot of swashbuckling. There are no guns or anything like that, of course, because it's set back then. She uses basically a saber, I think, is her sort of her weapon. There are 3 books in the series. I recommend them all. Terrific books. I don't suppose you've read them.
No, that's interesting. I mean, I'm definitely a comic reader, but those haven't.
Your daughter might enjoy these, actually.
Cool.
Because it's a strong female character in the lead. The second series is also time shifted. It's actually a modern day series, but it features a thief as the main character, and it's kind of comic, so the tone's a little different. But it is Timothy Hallinan's series featuring Junior Bender, a thief basically in LA, in the LA area of present day. It's a very funny series. There's often a couple of set pieces of him stealing something, which are terrific and have those moments that you get in Thief, where you're just about to be discovered and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do if that happens. And you get that perspective with Junior, who's very similar to Garrett in that he's kind of pleasant to be around. He is maybe a little archetypal, but you like him, and he definitely has problems with authority. So I recommend both of those series as tie-ins for the last 2 games we've done. I'm not going to go back and do all the other ones, but going forward, I'll try to find something that I've read sort of recently to tie in with the games we're playing here on the cast.
Cool, that's a good idea.
I thought, I read all these books. I should be able to do that for something other just my own personal edification. Let's move now to feedback. We have a few that have backed up that we haven't been able to get to because we had the interview, and last time was a kind of a short episode. You can send your feedback to devgameclub@gmail.com. And of course, although we're not reading any tonight, we'd love to have your reviews via the Apple Podcasts app. Sir, I've given you the first.
Okay, so this one's the subject is "Stop Right There, Criminal Scum," from Ethan Johnson. What was that? Did you say something?
I just went,
Oh, okay.
As you said, stop right. Yeah.
Greetings, Tim and Brett. I have not yet caught up with the whole series, but I had to skip ahead to listen to the latest Thief episode. This game is fascinating. It is a fascinating well of design and intent. To me, it's Looking Glass's most definitive game. While Underworld and System Shock are known today, I think they're far less tangible than Thief, which was really Looking Glass's only real shot at success, despite how you might view it as esoteric. In context of PC games at the time, it really wasn't. I'm currently working on an oral history to coincide with the 20th anniversary of the game's release, based on talking to many on the project. I look forward to whoever you bring on for the show, Greg Lopiccolo, who is not the co-founder of Harmonix.
Yeah, so I'll jump in there. Yeah, it's actually... oh my God! Now I've forgotten their names again. I'm the worst. I'll look it up, but yeah, even at the time I was like, I don't think that's right. He's president, but I don't think he founded it. Yeah. Anyway, so my apologies for the error. I will correct that by the end of the email.
Continuing, Ethan says, Greg is very approachable. As a small sneak peek, I can tell you that Thief had 2 producers before Greg. VA. Larksham?
I think VJ Lakshman.
Oh, VJ? Okay.
Yeah.
Producer of the original Elder Scrolls game.
Indian, not Hispanic.
Okay. Was the producer of the beta version Dark Camelot. Warren Spector was a brief producer on the Dark Project, which was another separate stage of development, which was the one pitch that IDOS and someone may still have the original pitch document for that. I would recommend also checking out Stealth Docs on YouTube, as he does design breakdowns of the stealth genre and understanding its context. This genre of stealth games is certainly fascinating in its own way, and it's going to be interesting to listen through you guys about what the industry has learned and unlearned since the days of Looking Glass. Best, Ethan Johnson.
Yes, so the Harmonix founders were Alex Rogopoulos and Aaron Agozi. So my apologies, I got that wrong. That was the first episode. Even when I was saying it, I was like, that's not right. Greg's the president now, but I didn't think he had found it, and I just kind of breezed on past it, as I sometimes do. We're not deep researchers on this show, so I actually appreciate this email, because it does call in a few things that are worth. I mean, this has obviously been a focus for Ethan. I think that's great, and I look forward to his oral history. But yeah, it's certainly interesting. I looked up some of these folks when, VJ in particular, I have an Elder Scrolls connection myself, and I will put a link in the show notes to the Stealth Docs YouTube channel for those who are curious. But I appreciate having that, and thank you for the correction in particular.
We didn't even plan on the 20th anniversary part of this. It didn't even dawn on us, or on me at least. But yeah.
Oh, it was entirely planned by me. Anyway.
Sure. You have another one?
Yeah, I do. I have. I'm going to read part of an email from Tim Dorr, who we mentioned last time because he had recommended the podcast with the Looking Glass employees, former Looking Glass employees. I can throw a link for that in the show notes again, but if you're looking for it, it was in last week's as well. And this is just a paragraph out of it because a lot of his suggestions for topics, most of which I hope we've covered, Tim. But I want to call out this: I'm very excited to hear that Thief will be your next game, having emailed to suggest it to you twice previously. That's another thing you can do, by the way. Feel free to email me games. I keep them all. I have a separate folder just of games that people have suggested. Anyway, he says, Thief remains my favorite game and makes complete sense in the context of other games you've covered previously. For example, Deus Ex, System Shock 2, Ultima Underworld, Half-Life, etc. I'm also interested to see how it will feel after the first Tomb Raider game. I agree that Tomb Raider carries a sense of isolation. I think that's one of the things that reduced my enjoyment. It was too quiet, lonely even. Thief, however, is never silent. If I remember rightly, it is accompanied by ambient soundscapes throughout. It surprises me that this game, characterized by voyeuristic lurking, is somehow far less lonely in feel than Tomb Raider. I suppose it is more densely populated by humans, which helps. I think also that Garrett's wry commentary reduces any loneliness. I may be playing Garrett, but I'm also with Garrett. I thought that was an interesting observation. Like I said, I'm not going to read the whole email, because most of it is topics that we've covered. What do you think about that? The sort of loneliness, not loneliness, even though you're in theory playing a character who should be even more of a loner in this one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. I think it's just down to different goals, of course. I do feel like even though you're surrounded by people, I still feel like a loner, because you're so, and the AI even speak of you and to you in that way, where you are this sort of unicorn in a way, right? When they're looking for you, right? They kind of talk about, your master abilities and how they're going to outsmart you, and and there's a little bit of like, they know how good you are toward the end of the game as well, which I thought was interesting, but. Yeah, it's the fact that you can't be a thief unless there are other people to be thieving right, around. Versus Lara, which again comes back for me to the goals and the fantasy of it. It's like she's an adventurer like her, Indy, are going into these places that are intentionally long abandoned, right? So there's just a different fantasy fulfillment there.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost apocalyptic, right? At that point, these are civilizations that have fallen. Yeah. And I mean, that almost feels like something that should be more interesting to us today. It just, I mean, that is part of what really speaks to me in Lara, is sort of the reclaiming of these civilizations by nature. I mean, particularly in the enemies, obviously the rendering's not quite there to support overgrowth of plants or whatever, but you do have the enemies there, and you do have some texture choices which reinforce the fact that that nature's taking over, and that's actually kind of a tie, I guess, with Thief, unintentionally, but yeah, I do agree with the point. I think the point's really interesting. You're right that Thief's thieves rather are entirely in opposition to an existing order, so they have to get up kind of cozy to that, and so it's not possible to be entirely lonely. So yeah, that's an interesting point.
I like his. I think he appropriately put it in that, Lara is alone, but Garrett is a loner. And a loner kind of implies that there are others around. It's just you're kind of unique.
You're going a different way.
Yeah, you're choosing a different path. So yeah, it's fascinating.
Let's throw it over to you. You have one from our man in Guernsey.
Okay, so this subject is Thief Podcast from Dan Hunter. Hi guys, just wanted to drop a line to the team at the go-to podcast for game development. Really enjoying your Thief podcast, as I've always been a big fan of the franchise from the first time around. For me, Thief marks the start of the golden age of the immersive sim, and as you rightly pointed out, marked Looking Glass as a favorite developer for those in the know. With the release of Thief, System Shock 2, and Deus Ex, it looked like nothing could derail the immersive sim as a new and strong genre, but after a couple of missteps in an attempt to bring this unique genre to the masses, we soon saw this exciting genre fall out of favor. It's nice to see that Looking Glass Games have influenced a current generation of developers to try their hand in creating immersive sims, and following your recommendations, I am now the proud owner of Prey and Dishonored 2. Thanks for that. You made me break the promise to myself where I wouldn't buy any new games before I'd completed the numerous outstanding games. Currently collect Virtual Dust in my Steam and GOG account. I wonder if I can play them using the flights sim I bought to play along. Flight Stick I bought to play along with TIE Fighter, your TIE Fighter playthrough. I wonder if you can do that. I would like to hear a report of that. Back in those days, there were games. I mean, I think we talked about this on Dark Forces, but like there was a control scheme for a flight stick for Dark Forces.
That's true. That was such a weird. It's such a weird time. I mean, and that's something we talked about, I think, when we talked about TIE Fighter, is that it was a time when there were a lot of flight sims, and in particular, that team had come through that. I mean, there had been flight sim people, and so was Darren, for that matter. Total interesting time from that standpoint. Actually, I was thinking about Thief and the audio that I was talking about a little earlier, and a similar thing happened kind of just after Thief, where that was the time where 5.1 audio started to come in sort of some of the advanced sound hardware, maybe a year or two after Thief. But I can just imagine what it would have been like to have a full 5.1 mix of Thief. To have full surround of that would have been pretty amazing. Anyway, yeah, Thief, I agree, is kind of the golden age of the immersive sim. Kind of kicks it off. I think Ultima Underworld just didn't penetrate enough, but Thief really did. And it meant that when System Shock 2 and Deus Ex came later, people were hungry for them. And has sort of established a market, I think. So yeah, definitely a great thing. And I'm glad they're still making games that are kind of near them, because I love them. Okay.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about the genre as a success or not, as he's kind of asking or kind of pointing out there, and the history of that, especially for Looking Glass, which no longer is around. The interesting thing about when I think about Prey and Dishonored and sort of the most recent ones, I don't know exactly how they did from a monetary and copies, sold copies perspective. I think the challenge that is interesting for this genre, though, because of the nature of the gameplay, I think from sort of a mass market perspective, it's hard to kind of penetrate through to get like huge numbers, because they're a little bit more of a thinking person's, kind of game, right? And sometimes, a lot of the casual gamers, want to just kind of get in there and have some simple fun and, get through it, which I understand and don't, and I want to do that myself sometimes. So I don't blame anybody, but with the difficulty of making big budget games these days, to make an immersive sim that is at the quality level that a Prey or a Dishonored has, it takes a big team. Takes a lot of money, a lot of resources, a long time. And if if it doesn't match the numbers there, then it's really I can assume and maybe bet that publishers, at least in the traditional model, do have a hard time kind of consistently investing in that. And that's just kind of the nature of the escalation of production. Back when Thief and System Shock, these teams were small. A level designer could do a lot of it by themselves. There's a lot of clever development going on, and the fidelity was lower, and etc.
Gray box was basically the only box.
Yeah, exactly. So it's gotten more complicated in general for game development. So I think that's going to continue to be a challenge for this genre.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and I know, while not being privy to any specific numbers, I do know that Dishonored 2 sold less than Dishonored did, which is not uncommon for a sequel. And then I feel like I read at the time that Prey sold less than Dishonored 2. So the trend line has not been good.
Yeah.
I don't know. And like I said, although I worked at Bethesda Game Studios, and their parent company also owns Arcane, ZeniMax. I have no exact knowledge, and I'm really just basing on that of things I've read on, for example, Kotaku. So no insider information there. But yeah, I would agree. You need a publisher who's willing to make those bets, I think, to do that again and again. And to be willing to sort of carry something that's not making a tremendous amount. Hopefully it's not losing money, but maybe it's just doing a little better than breaking even. And I think that the first Dishonored was quite successful in sort of this sort of niche way. I don't think those other titles have been quite what they hoped, but yeah, I mean, we're in an interesting time with the sort of games as a service model, and a lot of sort of, if you're going to go big, you have to go really, really big kind of games. I mean, you look at the latest Assassin's Creed or something like that, and you look at how huge those games are. And it's tough for these immersive sims to compete. But it opens up space for indies to try new stuff and, maybe try to make something that's procedural. And I'm thinking of, in particular, I forget, like Neon Struct is sort of a Deus Exy kind of, a Deus Exy kind of follow-up, right, by an indie. I mean, made by one guy. I
feel like We Happy Few is kind of a little bit in that.
Yeah, it's got elements for sure.
I think it has procedural elements.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, there's been some interesting other ways that people are trying to experiment and kind of keep that stuff going. So I hope that will continue to be the case. And I think that we also are getting to the point where the indies are kind of building up to the size that we were when we started in the industry. So 20 years ago. Maybe not quite that big, maybe, half a gen before us, 5 or 10, 15 people, and cutting away a lot of stuff that maybe you don't even need, cutscenes and things like that. So that do add a lot to production.
The one thing that I think we talked about off and on throughout this particular series and the other ones as well is, regardless of future, like pure immersive sim games coming out or not, I think there will always there'll be something out there. The thing that I always want to remind myself of is that the immersive sim as a genre has bled into a lot of other genres.
Sure. Yeah.
Because game developers, I think, respect them so much and take so much from them, and so, whether we get the pure ones or not, they definitely have influenced a lot of other games in small and large ways. So it's like there's always going to be some of those elements out there. Not that that's solace for, not being able to play a pure one every year or something, but it is something. And I also just noticed I missed part of Dan's.
That's okay. There's a link in there. It's totally fine. So don't worry about it. One of the link is time relevant, and the time has passed. And the other I've already mentioned last week. He was the other person who mentioned the podcast. All right.
He has a great tagline though as he signs off.
Okay, go ahead with the tagline. That's cool.
Well, I have to sign off as I'm going to the bear pits tomorrow.
It's
Cheers,
Indeed.
Dan Hunter. I
Off
had to
the
read
bear
that.
prints. Yeah, I mean, I've heard that bears are a real problem on Guernsey, an island, a small island. Anyway,
there's a
all
bear
right.
on my island. Turns out
It's probably you.
No,
Anyway,
yeah.
so I've got a last email here from the second quest called Flesh Levels. He says, hey, a couple episodes ago, probably a few now, you brought up the subject of when the pattern of games ending in levels with an organic or flesh-like design aesthetic began. While I don't know a definitive start point for such a trend, I can think of a notable example dating back to the original NES. Contra hit the system in 1988 and featured normal levels, in quotes, like natural environments and industrial sci-fi military complexes. But the final level got weirder. With Contra borrowing heavily from Aliens and Predator, it's no surprise that the last stage evokes aliens with organic, fleshy-looking floors, ceilings, and eggs bursting open with facehugger-like critters. With Aliens coming out in 1986 and Predator in 1987, the time frame for those films seems to be an influence on the game's development, or seems like a plausible origin that would continue to inspire other games down the road, as those films and Contra became oft-referenced classics. Another one that comes to mind is a lesser-known title called Abadox, which was a horizontal shoot-'em-up shmup set entirely within the body of a giant alien creature. So the whole game has an organic design approach, even if it lacks that last level goes from normal to organic shift you're referring to. That one came out a couple of years later, though, Billy. So thank you, Billy. I actually have never even heard of Abadox, but I'm not a shmupper, so I'm not super versed in those. That's actually probably a bit of a blind spot and not something we've talked about doing. This is point. I mean, he's doing some good connecting of the dots here for sure. I mentioned this earlier on the cast. We're not a research we're not journalists. We're not going and doing a ton of digging. Often we're really just kind of giving our critical and game development eye looking at titles. But these are interesting touch points for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't even occur to me to think back to 8 and 16-bit, but it's fair. There's definitely got to be some other examples. Alien Syndrome, I don't know, I can try to think of even some arcade examples that make some sense to it. And it's just sort of, science fiction and fantasy trope stuff that, does make some sense in the grand scheme of things. It just was, I think just by chance, the games we've happened into playing for the podcast, a lot of them were kind of in the same sort of 5-ish year span,
right.
And it's just sort of a little too convenient to see all of them in such a short amount of time. And it still happens today. And we haven't even played Halo, for instance, with some of the bio science fiction going on there too. So yeah.
I would love to play Halo again. I don't want to play that final level co-op. That's all I don't want to do. Oh boy. Okay. Anyway, thanks so much to, the second quest, Dan, Tim, and Ethan for sending an email. I also had an email from Eric Bartizak. Sorry. That's Wayun number 6 on my streams, who is how I normally think of him, who actually wrote in just to say that it was great to hear Jill Murray on the cast and how much he appreciated the interview. Thanks to all of them and that was a great interview.
It was.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
Thanks to all those folks for sending mail to devgameclub@gmail.com. Sir, here we are at the end of another game. We haven't picked our next game, but we've got some stuff lined up for this one. So I think we can pretty conclusively say we're going to speak to some folks next week about Thief.
Yes, very exciting.
Yes, and that's pretty well locked down. So we're just quibbling over what hour of the day we're going to do it. So next week you should hear an interview. I hope even the week after you'll also hear an interview. Which will be fascinating.
We have riches of interviews right now for this series, so we lucked out on that. So yeah, it's very exciting.
Yeah, so we're a couple of weeks away from announcing another game. If anything should ever fall through, however, you'll be able to find information on the Twitter feed for the podcast, which is at twitter.com/devgameclub. And you, sir, on Twitter are at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
I have quit Twitter, but I have been streaming more often at twitch.tv/Brett Duville. That's without the underscore in between. And I am occasionally blogging again at brettduville.com. So you can find me there as well as a huge list of all the books I've read, if you're curious. In any case, I think that's going to be it for us this week. Have fun playing games, and good night.
Good night.